Well, hello, everyone. I'm Perry Stevens from the Electric Power Research Institute. I want to thank everyone today for joining. Here today, we're on panel 2, session 2, where we'll be focusing on analysis. Before we start, I have a few housekeeping items. First of all, again, thank you to all of our sponsors, especially DTE, the host sponsor. And remember, you can click on that sponsor link on the left-hand column to visit the site and see more about the work that we do. Also, just a reminder that there is a link to the attendees if you want to look at that, also on the left-hand side. And you'll also find a resources tab where you can find conference proceedings, the attendee list, and then there's an important evaluation survey that we'd like for you to all to complete at the end of the session. With that, we'd like to begin with our first speaker. Ali Hassanbeghi is founder, CEO, and research director at Global Energy Efficiency, GEI, an industrial energy efficiency and decarbonization consulting firm in Florida. Dr. Hassanbeghi has over 15 years of international experience working on industrial energy efficiency and decarbonization for the manufacturing sector. Prior to founding GEI, he worked for over 7 years as a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in Berkeley, California. Dr. Hassanbeghi has a total of over 100 publications. He's also served as contributing author for the industrial chapter of the IPCC's 5th assessment report on mitigation of climate change, and has served as guest editor for the Resources Conservation and Recycling Journal. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Hassanbeghi.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you, Perry, for the introduction. So as said, my name is Ali Hassanbeghi from Global Efficiency Intelligence, and I'm going to present today research work we did on industrial electrification. I hope you can see my slides well. This is a work we conducted, and we published a report actually earlier this year. A little background on this. A few years ago, around 2014-15, when I started looking at electrification, realized that there is quite a bit of lack of information out there, like at the level of information we have for example, energy efficiency or decarbonization technology, did not find as much on electrification. Specifically when it comes to subsector level information and systems level. So this study aimed to kind of fill some of that information gap. So this was a collaborative work with that Global Efficiency Intelligence and David Gardiner Associates. They conducted for Renewable Thermal Collaborative. As I mentioned, we publish a report, pretty long report, over 120 pages, so very extensive details. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to go download the report and look at more detail, because in this 20 minutes, probably I will just give you a snapshot of some examples of what we have done. So without further ado, let me just go ahead and talk about the work we did. The work had actually 2 to 3 parts. One of the largest part of the work was technical assessment on electrification in different industrial subsector. And then we also conducted some survey on barriers to electrification industry from different stakeholders, and we develop an action plans. All are included in our report. So when you look at US manufacturing energy use, you can see a lot of it is related to process heating, CHP cogeneration, and conventional boiler. So a lot of fuel heat is used, like around 2/3. So just from that point of view, if we talk about, electrify everything, that's like a catchword now. For industry, that's a lot to electrify. So in a word, a lot of potential, and as a result, a lot of challenges there. But not all industries created equal. Like when we talk about electrification, often some people jump to conclusion that it's challenging, difficult. It is in some cases, but they give an example, for example, of cement industry. Uh, some high temperature processes, they are more challenging to electrify, with some exception. For example, for steel industry, it's high temperature, but we have electric arc furnace already fully commercial and working. But if you look across different industrial subsectors, you can see that a significant portion of heat used in different industrial sectors are actually low temperature or medium temperature. And just looking at that indicator, that relatively speaking, lower temperature processes are easier to electrify, or easier to provide heat through some electrified processes. So it's not all high temperature, difficult, challenging processes. There are a lot of so-called low-hanging fruit, I would say. This other graph shows it in different way. This is by my colleague in NREL, Colin McMillan, created this graph that very clearly shows the basically heat demand profile in U.S. manufacturing. And you can see 2/3 of the process heat used in the U.S. industry is for application below 300 degrees C or 572 Fahrenheit. So that's significant portion of the heat in industry that is low to medium temperature. So that's an encouraging news. So what we did, we looked at 13 different industrial subsectors in the US. They're listed on the right-hand side. And for each of those subsectors, we went and looked at the existing heating system. Usually we looked at the major processes where the heating is done. So what's the heating profile, why the heating is used, what's the temperature, and so on. And based on that understanding, we look for suitable electrified technologies that can provide that service for heating. And then we did some system process integration for this electrification analysis, and from that we calculated what would be the energy saving or GHG emission reduction or increase, and some cost implication. So that we did for 13 different subsectors, and I will show you some example. In addition to that, we developed a separate scenario where we looked at what if we electrify all conventional industrial boilers in the US. So when you electrify a boiler, you don't touch the process as much, and you just go to boiler room and electrify the boiler. So it has that advantage, although you will have some losses in the boiler, steam distribution, etc. But for the other 13 sectors that I said we analyzed, we looked at electrifying actually the end use process, the process itself where the heating is done. So whether through heat pump, radio frequency, dryer, microwave, name it, we looked at the range of different electrification technologies that can be applied in this 13 sector. So just give you an example, very quick. This is an example for container glass industry. It accounts for about 40+% of the glass production in US. Pretty energy intensive and important sector. So if I quickly explain this table to you, on the middle, you can see different major process steps that we have. On the left-hand side, we show the conventional process, and major equipment, especially heating equipment, are listed there, and what is the electricity intensity and thermal intensity for that conventional process for each step. And then through our analysis, we identified where the heat is used, what kind of electrified technology we can implement there. And as you can see, we have there, for example, electric glass melter. Actually, that's fully commercial technology, electric for health, etc. So we identify those electrified processes, and then also energy or electricity intensity for those. And from that, we did the comparison of the intensities. If you look at the bottom row, you can see the electrified process actually uses lower energy intensity in final energy term. And then from there, we kind of use the total glass production and some other variables to calculate the total energy and GHG implications. So this graph shows the result from for the energy for the container glass industrial electrification. Basically, it shows the change in the total final energy use after we electrify, and the numbers are negative to indicate the change is reduction. So that's why numbers are negative. And one thing also to note, this is the total technical potential. So these are 100% adoption of this technology, electrification technology in this sector. So we don't have some sort of adoption rate. This is 100% technical potential. And you can see we get significant reduction in energy use, final energy use right off the bat, and it increases over time to 2050. When we go to CO2, it's a different story though. So for the CO2 analysis, we use US grid emission and emission factor, which are shown in the table below. So if you use the US emission factor in 2019, if you fully electrify glass industry tonight, you will see an increase in basically your CO2 emission. The reason is, grid is not decarbonized enough. But as the grid decarbonized with the assumptions listed clearly below the graph, you can see we start getting the CO2 emission reduction benefit, and then significantly increase over time as the grid decarbonizes more. So this is using US grid. Of course, if you have a project and you go buy renewable energy directly, even like today, you can get the CO2 benefit right away. But this is at the national level, using US grid, we get this result. We also did the cost analysis, but only for energy cost. So we did the comparison of energy cost per ton of product, per ton of container glass. So this graph shows 2019 and 2050 comparison for conventional process and electrified process. The blue is natural gas cost because the conventional process uses, and also the orange is electricity cost. You can see basically the electrified process costs almost twice as the conventional process. And the reasons are clear. In US, at least now, the natural gas is pretty cheap and electricity actually relatively expensive. So, and the assumptions actually we use for the electricity and natural gas prices are listed here. For example, we use a little over 7 cents a kilowatt hour for 2019, and the projections based on EIA actually remains about the same in the constant dollar term. When we presented this to some stakeholder, they said, the prices for renewable electricity may go actually down significantly. So we did the sensitivity analysis and added those error bars. So those error bars basically show what if the electricity price drops by 50%, meaning instead of 7 cents, we use like 3.5 cents. And then if you, in that case, you should compare the lower end of the error bar, and then you can see electrified process basically is pretty competitive, especially when you look at 2050. So in summary, certainly what will be the electricity price, especially for renewable electricity price in the future, significantly have an impact in the cost benefit of the electrification. Just quickly, one other thing we did for industrial boiler, as I mentioned, developing this whole different scenario. As we can see, boiler account for a significant share of energy use in different industries. So we have the conventional boilers and how much energy they use, and we identify the electric boilers and the efficiency. And as you know, the efficiency of the electric boilers are pretty high. As a result, you get the reduction in energy use in final energy term. And from that, we went ahead and calculated also energy and CO2 emission reduction. And as you can see, again, the change is in final energy use is significant. Immediately, we get over 150,000 terajoule per year. Of course, this is total technical potential if you electrify all industrial boilers in the US. CO2 is the same story. If you use the grid emission, which was the assumption of this study, with the current grid, you will get increase in CO2 emission. But then as the grid decarbonizes, you will get significant reduction, especially if you look at 2050, it's like huge amount of CO2 emission reduction. On the cost, I already explained the graph. So basically the same story. You can see electrified boiler costs like 3 times, energy cost for electrified boiler almost 3 times compared to conventional boiler. And for conventional boiler, we use natural gas, of course, mostly, so not coal and other things. So if you do this analysis for example, China or Europe, where natural gas is much more expensive, the bar for conventional process is going to be much higher, so kind of more competitive. But again, if you assume instead of 7 cents a kilowatt hour, like 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, meaning if you compare the lower end of the error bars, you can see even in this case, electrified boiler can be fairly cost competitive. One thing to note here for the cost, again, we looked at only energy cost comparison. Of course, the more proper would be doing a whole full life cycle kind of costs, or at least take into account, the capital investment and other major costs. So it was out of the scope of this study, and we did not include those. Just look at the energy costs. Just quickly show you the result, a snapshot of the result for 2050 change in CO2 emission reduction for all the sectors we analyzed. You can see some of the largest sector we analyzed with the significant reduction in CO2 is like a steel, ammonia, paper, plastic, wet corn milling, etc. So if you go to our report, you will see the detail. Well, don't try to read the numbers. Just want to show you we have detail by subsector, by year, both energy and CO2 results in our report, that if you are interested, you can go and look for more detail. Very quickly on action plan. So we developed around 7, 8, 10 pages, actually detailed action plan, where we listed some of the actions that different actors, whether it's industry, government, utilities, and suppliers of these electrification technologies should or could take. And we also categorized those into R&D, education, policy, workforce, and public-private partnership. If I may quickly touch upon some of those. For the industrial sector, we identified that industry actually should initiate partnership with academia and national labs, especially in US. We have 17 very capable national labs that industry can work with to develop some of these electrification technologies that are in the earliest stage, or demonstrate them, or try to improve them. And also work with policymaker and utilities to educate the benefit of this, and also express their needs. What would they need from policy makers, utilities, and regulatory point of view, and the finances that they may need for the electrification of industry. And last but certainly very important, training of the workforce. I mean, when you replace your process and put a heat pump, you need to make sure folks in the plant can actually work with that heat pump. So the training of the workforce is very important. For the government, certainly providing incentive for research, development, and demonstration of the electrification technologies. Again, we have powerful universities and national labs can definitely help here. Provide incentive, whether it's in terms of tax credit or any kind of incentive to try to pilot some of these newer electrification process. However, keep in mind, some of these electrification processes or technologies are fairly commercial, and it's just out there. People need to go pick them up and adopt them. And also conducting techno-economic analysis. There is definitely a lack of information out there. Again, when we talk about information, meaning subsector level, system level, technology level for industry. Doing some top-down aggregate analysis is not as helpful. So as we did in this study, and this was really scratching the surface, you need to get into subsector and processes to provide those level of information. And utilities, certainly key players. Once industry is electrified, it's a huge, demand response potential. I'm not sure if they have really assessed that appropriately. Providing information about this about electric rates and market structures and grid upgrade implications that this industrial electrification may have, and also design kind of rate that kind of encourages electrification. But if industry really goes towards electrification, it has huge implication for grid and infrastructure, and utilities need to start really preparing for that. Again, I would like to refer you to our report for more detail on this. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer later on this session, or you can email me. Thank you very much.
You're muted, Perry.
I'm sorry. Next, we have Liz Watts, who is with us today to talk about additional analytics. Liz is a postdoctoral researcher in industrial energy modeling at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. She received her PhD in agricultural and biological engineering from Purdue University, from which she also holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering. She has a Master of Arts in Desert Studies from Ben Gurion University of the Negev and a Bachelor of Arts in Ancient History and Classical Civilizations from the University of Texas at Austin. Her research is focused on sustainability science and industrial ecology, particularly in connection with renewable energy transition. With that, I'll hand it over to Liz.
Hello, thank you so much, Perry. So I'm going to really focus a lot from Allie's really interesting presentation about the electrification of industry. But I want to point out, as we start talking about this, that it's not that unrelated, because for his work, he's depending on a lot of different assumptions going forward in modeling different industries. And it seems to me, although I haven't gotten to chat with him about it, that he probably has had to develop a lot of these models himself. So what I'm going to talk about is our efforts here. I work with Colin McMillan at NREL in trying to understand a better classification scheme for industry and that might allow us to do better energy system modeling. So this is really exploratory work, and so I'm very interested in any comments that any of you have or ideas and suggestions based on your own experience, whether it's for data sources or other ideas that you may have in terms of what you think are better classification schemes. But I'll just walk you through a little snapshot of where we are and a description of the research work we've been doing. So this came about because of a recognition that for modeling work, there's a lot of really well-advanced models that talk about energy use by buildings. And when it comes to industrial energy use, the same cannot really be said. And this is because industries are very heterogeneous. So there's a lot of different processes within one kind of industry. And at the same time, as we think about decarbonization, some of those processes are going to be changing. So for the development of models, most people rely on data from MECs, and this is reported at the NAICS code level. And at even the 6-digit NAICS code level, there are around 1,200 different codes. So just to give an example that may be meaningful, yesterday I saw a very interesting presentation by Christina Chang from ARPA-E, and she was talking about pathways to iron and steel production that allow better decarbonization and have varied impacts on energy use. All of those paths, while they vary quite a bit by energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, will all fall under a single NAICS 6-digit code. So knowing that a plant falls in that code may not tell us very much about its energy use and how we should expect it to change over time. And when you consider that then we have to multiply that by 1,200, and so that we're looking not only at sectors that may be very much studied, such as iron and steel, but other sectors that maybe no one here is thinking that much about, it becomes important to come up with a classification scheme that can allow us to quickly make better assessments of their energy use and how that will change. So the guiding research question for this work is trying to understand how should industries be grouped in order to understand and project energy use. To look at that question, we've spent some time trying to understand how they're grouped now. So that includes looking at current structures, whether it's NAICS or others. So I am showing you one here to depict that, to give a sense. So if you look at the whole economy, this comes from the International Labor Organization statistics. You can divide it into agriculture and non-agriculture. And then on the non-agriculture side, we can divide it into industry, utilities, and services. And then in industry, manufacturing, construction, and mining and quarrying, to give some general categories. And a lot of the time, when we're talking about industry, we're really only talking about manufacturing. So it's important to look at this also to think about where are the gaps in our thinking, where are the gaps that we may not be really accounting for when we're talking about these issues. So we're interested in figuring out what other schemes are possible and which of those might allow us to shed more light on energy use. And for this work in particular, we wanted to look at plant level data that's available and see if by looking at it for patterns, we can get some good information that helps us to come up with some archetypes or some classification scheme. So a data source that we found that is that has also been mentioned here in the summer study is the Industrial Assessment Centers, which is a program that's been operating since 1976 and has made publicly available their records, and they cover over 19,000 observations. For this, we cut off our search for data at 2010, which still left us with 5,000 records or more. They are focused on small to medium establishments with, I think the cutoff is less than 500 employees. And when I say electricity use is overrepresented, usually in industry, a lot of what we're talking about is the use of fuels, and these establishments tend to use more electricity and less fuel than industry as a total. And as you can see, it's a really small subset. NAICS 31 to 33 are manufacturing codes, and as you can see, in recent years, there's at any rate there's upwards of 300,000 establishments, and in any given year, only around 1,000 of them are being sampled in this for this work. So, to understand this data set, we used supervised and unsupervised methods. And so I'm just going to give a little overview of that. For supervised learning, we just referred to the fact that we looked at the data and using our own knowledge of what the data set includes, we know more or less what we think are independent and dependent variables. So we weren't able to use the whole data set because some of the areas are very sparsely populated, and some of them have some inconsistencies over time. So the variables that we ended up using are electricity use, demand, total combustion fuel use, production hours, number of employees, plant area, and sales. So because for most of our purposes, we're thinking about energy use, so the top three as our dependent variables, and we're interested in thinking of the bottom four as our independent variables. So for supervised learning, I just mean that we looked at this. We looked at the classification scheme that already exists, which are the NAICS codes, and we looked at the Pearson correlation between all of these different variables, and I'll show that to you later. We then decided to perform unsupervised learning, and so the difference here is that we try to put as few preconceptions as possible on the data and see what kind of patterns emerge by letting the machine work through clustering algorithms to try to find patterns. It does involve some pre-processing. In order for the machine to work, we need to make sure that all the variables share a scale, so we perform scaling and standardization on them. The data set is skewed, so we had to remove skew by performing transformations. We also got rid of outliers, and then to make sure that energy was included in our data points, we decided to perform this on ratios between the more descriptive variables and the energy-related variables. And then we performed clustering, which I'll explain in the next slide. We could do some limited validation of the unsupervised learning by comparing the correlation among the clusters to that of the NAICS codes. So to give some background on clustering for people that may not be as familiar with it, the first method that we use is called hierarchical. And hierarchical clustering, and the first step, all of the data set is divided into a single node for each observation. At each step of the algorithm, the closest pair of nodes to each other is merged. And so you use a distance metric for this, and there's no randomness to it. So it will always, if you run it multiple times, it will come up with the same hierarchy. We used the Ward method for distance calculations. The second clustering technique that we used is called k-means. K refers to the number of clusters, so that must be determined from the beginning. And in the first step, centroids are, so this, actually this graphic shows it. And the first step, you have centroids that are randomly identified. Each observation in the data set is assigned to the nearest centroid. And then based on where the observations fall, a new centroid is calculated. This process is continued until centroids don't change when the process is followed. This does involve some randomness based on the initial centroids that are chosen. So this was repeated 25 times. We attempted it from between 1 to 100 clusters, and we used a random seed to ensure replicability. Okay, so just to give you some visuals that allow you to see this, the top right shows the hierarchical clustering. And so at the bottom, you can see with all the observations in single cluster, and it moves up to the top to where they all go into one cluster, and that's the dendrogram. We also performed principal component analysis that allows us to take the 7 dimensions and put them into only 2, and just show you that there's not a clear grouping you can see in 2 dimensions between the clusters. These are the results of the clustering. We can see for hierarchical clusters, I'm showing you results from 14 clusters that were shown by some of the heuristics we used to be a good number. The clusters varied in their composition according to the variable values, so that's positive, and that the clustering is performing some kind of differentiation that we can understand. Hierarchical did not work as well for fuel consumption as it did for the other variables. For the k-means clusters, one thing that you can notice, although perhaps if I go back and forth, you can see you don't get the same, the observations don't fall in the same clusters regardless of the technique. So that's one thing that we notice. K-means seems to be better at dividing fuel consumption, but it's less successful in separating the number of employees, sales, and electricity consumption. And since those tend to be more important, it seemed like hierarchical is better for this work in terms of our results. So this shows you, this is, as we talked about, the correlation on 3-digit NAICS subsectors. Supervised classification is shown here. And what you can see, so blank spaces have insufficient data, and there's not a really strong correlation. The one that has the most, the most dark areas is probably the employees versus energy and material use. And that one, you don't see a really strong correlation. For the other ones, you really don't see that much correlation whatsoever. And this is by 3-digit NAICS codes on the side, on the y-axis. So when we look at the clustering, it seems a little bit more promising because you also see a lot of areas where there's not a particularly strong correlation. But when we look at electricity consumption and electricity demand, you do start to see, and this is only with 14 clusters versus 23 3-digit NAICS subsectors, you do start to see some dark areas where there is higher correlation. So this is promising. But like I mentioned, this is really a snapshot of the work. We feel encouraged by this because we are seeing that by looking at a smaller number of clusters from this data, we can see as high or higher correlations than with the NAICS codes. But we still need to look, this is showing some of the heuristics that can be used to look at a good number of clusters. We need to explore that space a little more and try to understand what's happening with different numbers of clusters, where are some interesting trends happening, and we also need to look inside the clusters and try to understand what they signify. What does it mean that we have cluster number 1? What kind of establishments are falling in there, and will this actually be something that we can distinguish in a useful way? So that's a next step that's pretty important. And like I mentioned, because IAC is not representative of all industries, this still is just one step that has to be combined with other work looking at industries that fall outside of the guidelines. So thank you very much. And like I said, I welcome all of your comments later.
Thank you, Liz. Please again remind everyone, if you have questions for Liz, just drop those in the chat box, and we'll be asking questions of all the panelists at the end. Our next presenter is Peter Thurkelson, and he's a research scientist and deputy of the Building and Industrial Applications Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. His work focuses on understanding how organizations create and use energy management systems to achieve energy performance, greenhouse gas, and other economic objectives. He has developed multiple SEM, that's Strategic Energy Management Program, designs, and measurement and verification guidelines, and participated in SEM program evaluations, and is a leader of U.S. engagement with the International Committee responsible for ISO 50001. With that, let me hand it over to Peter.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I can see your chat, so do let me know if you cannot hear me. I don't think I muted myself. So it looks like we have got a lot of time for questions and answers later in the session, which is fantastic. And I know I have some either follow-up ones for Ali and Liz later. Fantastic talks to follow. This being an analysis panel, I'd say this presentation is a little bit on the lighter side of analysis, but I think it offers a lot of opportunities to build upon others' analysis and opportunities identified to really strike hard at our decarbonization needs for our country and world. And we'll get right into it. First, the title of this talk, Carbon Management Requires Energy Management. This theory, this concept, this approach, and this work that we are conducting with the Department of Energy is a labor of love of many people, not even nearly myself. First, our team at Berkeley Lab, co-led by Paul Schaefer, your conference co-chair, Prakash Rao, myself, with an incredible team working collaboratively together. And then, of course, at the Department of Energy, both inside the Advanced Manufacturing Office, our former and current program manager, our current being Ethan Rogers, as well as supporting staff in other energy efficiency offices at the Department of Energy, including the Building Technologies Office, the Weatherization Office, the Federal Energy Management Program Office with Jay Robel, and of course back to AMO. So this is a big consideration, a big push, a big effort for the department that we're very excited to race forward with, while at the same time balance to make sure whatever we produce and do is a useful product, service, resource that is adapted by companies, sites, corporations, utilities, other programs to increase their success in our collective decarbonization efforts. And while there are a trillion great quotes and pieces to show of what the problem is, we all collectively know it. I have a feeling that most of us on this talk today deeply in our hearts understand this. And I want to highlight this quote from our current president back in late January. And the bolded line, "We have a narrow moment to pursue action." And if I were to critique this one line, I'd say we have a narrow moment to pursue huge action at home and abroad. And we need to act quickly and on a scale of magnitude that is going to be a challenge for us all. So we need to do things at scale. We can't decarbonize in small one-off little projects. This is a big, bold need. The title of the talk, Carbon Management Requires Energy Management. When we look at what's really driving climate change and the air quality emissions that are driving this, we look globally because this is a global problem. And when we look to the IPCC reports, we see that carbon dioxide is the biggest contributor to this forcing function. And of course, as we know, a lot of that comes from the direct use of fossil fuels as the primary source of carbon dioxide emissions, both at individual sites or through the generation of electricity. Methane emissions, mostly agricultural activities, waste management, but there is a sizable energy use fraction within that, leakages from pipelines, and biomass burning as well. Nitrous oxide, agricultural activities, again, is the leading contributor to the nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use primarily, but fossil fuel combustion also generates nitrous oxide. We've gotten pretty good, especially with natural gas and some other simpler hydrocarbons, to produce low levels of nitrous oxide from a human health perspective, but it still is a climate change forcing function. And then the fluorinated gases, industrial processes, refrigeration. And while that is not directly something you say, well, that's not energy related, it still relates back to process, especially within the manufacturing sector, and process improvements to reduce the need for the amount of those gases, let alone the technologies that are using them and alternatives for those gases themselves. Zeroing down on the United States a little bit, if you're ever to watch Energy Secretary Graham Holden's Twitter feed, you would think that it was the Department of Climate Change and Emissions Reduction, which, again, as a person individually, I'm so in love with right now, because I think we do have this narrow window of time to act in a big, bold way. And one of the top priorities under the Biden administration for the department is climate change. And with the president's objective of a path to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And this is not DOE specific. This is, of course, across the entirety of the federal sector, with other agencies like US EPA really leading this charge to achieve this objective. And DOE has its role within that larger federal community. And again, just highlighting this point again of the relationship between energy and climate change emissions. We look at energy as a portion of all US emissions that are climate change foreseen. We see an enormous fraction is directly relatable to energy. That IPPU, that's industrial process and product use. Again, that touches on the manufacturing sector for sure. And so we can even, begin to address that wedge a little bit within this type of context of manufacturing. So we have a knowledge of things are not looking great up in the atmosphere in terms of climate change. We have lots and lots of well-validated models and understanding of what levels of carbon dioxide atmospherically we need to be at to make life more palatable for us all here on planet Earth. This then results in lots of very specific carbon targets that are set at different geographic and temporal levels globally. We know we need to reduce emissions by nearly 8% annually for the next 10 years. That's from the United Nations to reach the 1.5C target. Nationally, you see the 2015 and to be updated Paris Agreement contributions to that larger global objective. I mentioned earlier the current president's net zero carbon emission goal by 2050. So we have a magnitude and we have a timeline connected to this target. We see lots of corporate targets developing, and they look like, very different sometimes. More and more are being what are called science-based targets, which pin themselves on a analysis to limit global warming well below the 2°C mark of pre-industrial levels. You also see more kind of universal targets of zero carbon or zero net carbon, other reductions against some type of baseline with some type of time period to achieve that target. And then down when you get to the facility or site level, sometimes targets are regulatory set, sometimes they're set by that corporate level, sometimes individual sites have a science-based target. Maybe they have a cost-effective target that they're looking for to compete with other activities. There's a zero net carbon or a zero carbon, again, types of targets we see. So people know where they need to get to. And people also have been told how to say if they've gotten there and to say where they're currently at. The Greenhouse Protocol, authored by WRI and others, is a leading global protocol that specifies how carbon emissions currently and carbon emission reductions, sorry, greenhouse gas emissions reductions should be accounted for, calculated, and reported. So we have clear targets and we have clear reporting that we need to account for. And one trick I'd say, and this is work that's currently being led by Prakash Rao at LBNL, looking at, and others outside of LBNL as well, is looking at, is there a disconnect between how we typically report energy savings and how the big greenhouse gas protocols report carbon savings? Do we need to have a knowledge gap filled so that we correctly translate energy savings to carbon savings when we're talking about programs, especially in the utility sphere? I know where I need to go. I know where I am and how I have to say when I got there, but I have no idea how I'm going to get there. I don't know how I'm going to achieve my carbon reductions and get to that target within the time frame I've been told. And when you look at this summiting this mountain of decarbonization at a site or within a company or within a country, it can be seen very daunting and a tremendous number of ways to invest very finite resources to achieve that outcome. So I have my goal, I have my reporting requirements, and someone's given me a deadline. What are you going to do? Who do you involve? Where do you focus your activities? How long will it take? And why do you have confidence your approach will work? You need a plan. You need a system. You need a structure. You need something that a team can center around, a team can build upon, and a team can make action on over time to make smart strategic investments to achieve your objective when you need to achieve it by. We know that decarbonization is going to require both technical and management challenges. This makes the problem all the more complicated and the need for a system all the more important. This isn't just the engineering department or the facilities department running off and making some tweaks to the boiler or the compressed air system. It's not just management saying, oh, we have a new policy, therefore the problem is solved. This is a problem that's going to engage both people and technology across a very wide spectrum of opportunities to meet the decarbonization objectives that they have. I keep using the word system, and we titled this talk, Carbon Management Requires Energy Management. And an energy management system is a business practice, is a concept that connects people and technical solutions in a way that's understandable by all. It's a documented process, it's a documented set of requirements, a documented practice that will be performed by an organization to keep people moving towards their objectives in a logical and strategic way. This should engage people all across an organization, from top management to those that you would normally think about in terms of managing energy directly, those energy, environmental, health, and safety managers, as well as people who actually touch the use of energy on a day-to-day basis, those production managers and staff that are using the equipment that consume that large amount of energy that is producing those greenhouse gas emissions. A system is needed. In this case, we're showing a plan, do, check, act cycle, a Deming cycle. It doesn't have to be rocket science, better yet if it's simple, but it needs to be a process that people can point to, understand it, and implement. As I mentioned, this brings together both business management and energy engineering. This brings together the technical and the business processes. And it needs to be verifiable. It doesn't mean that you need a third-party auditor coming in necessarily to check to see if you're practicing this process correctly or that you're achieving the decarbonization objectives that you want. Maybe it does for your organization, maybe it does for your regulations, but maybe you internally just need to understand that, look yourself in the mirror and say, yes, we are practicing the process that we've set forward, and we are achieving the objectives that we want to achieve, or we're on the path to meeting them. This brings us to ISO 50001. It too is a business practice. It's an energy management system framework. Why an energy management system framework for a decarbonization or GHG reduction effort? Again, that connection of energy use and consumption to greenhouse gas emissions by and large. 50001 is a framework for the continual improvement of energy performance that is easily adapted to include greenhouse gas, energy-related greenhouse gas emission performance improvement and objectives as well. Importantly, it is a framework that is defined, and it's a global standard developed by over 56 countries under US leadership for more than a decade, getting closer to 2 decades now, that is understood, it is translatable, and it's transferable across international lines. So a company that is implementing ISO 50001 and prioritizing decarbonization within that in Germany is more or less understood to be doing the same types of activities, maybe to a different degree, applied a little differently, but as a company in Taiwan that is applying the same ISO 50001 framework for its decarbonization objectives. This helps a lot with standardizing workforce development, helping people who move between sites within a company or move up from a site to a corporate responsibility. It also helps when people enter the workforce that they have a common understanding of what this business practice would look like. It's also a flexible roadmap that's currently being used by 42,000 sites worldwide as surveyed by the International Standards Organization. It is the flexibility of this roadmap that provides the specifics of what types of actions an organization needs to take on, but is flexible to allow that organization to adapt them to their current business practices and resource availability. One of the hallmarks of the US engagement with the development ISO 50001 is data-driven and accessible. The United States has a strong interest in seeing that these practices be the results of these practices be quantifiable, demonstratable, and understood by parties all around the world, as well as accessible for small manufacturers and large manufacturers alike. There's a lot of talk that ISO 50001 is really hard for small manufacturers, and I would tend to comment on that ISO 50001 is really hard for organizations that aren't committed to it and don't have the resources to commit to this practice. And we do see lots of small companies that are very successful with ISO 50001, but it is true. We see much more larger organizations with more resources being more successful with 50001. And I think it's one of those observations and truths which drives DOE to create resources and tools that are more accessible than the full-blown standard with third-party certification. We'll get to that in a second. We know from quantification and observation and hearing from participants that ISO 50001 saves energy, and that we see increased performance at the individual site and across corporations and meeting energy goals sooner rather than later. We know that it builds both resilience around energy itself, because people are looking more holistically at the uses of energy within an organization and at individual sites, but it also builds institutional knowledge and engages staff across an organization to build that resilience, mitigating the disruptions due to personnel changes. We know that it can drive decarbonization. And this is an effort that obviously we're engaged in right now. We're trying to expand outwards, but we've heard from participants of ISO 50001 based programs that the framework that they use to manage energy is flexible enough that they can insert energy related GHG objectives and be successful with the same business practice. And that we know it promotes efficiency. We know that those that are practicing continuous improvement through the 50001 system obtain and maintain their targets, they're implementing more capital projects, and they're finding success in looking at new technologies that they may not have assessed prior to this. A quick graph without going into too many details. There are a number of publications that we've put out over time that speak to the quantifiable improvement of energy performance for those organizations that practice some form of ISO 50001 based energy management. There's more work again being led by our colleague Prakash Rao right now, looking in a lot of detail at the long persistence of energy performance improvement that we see with ISO 50001 based companies. There'll be a lot more to come on that. And again, DOE over the past couple decades now has been supporting ISO 50001 uptake through the development of software tools, voluntary recognition programs, workforce training and accreditation, measurement and verification activities, and fundamentally research. And that can be spread across any of these topics, including understanding the base value propositions and effective ways of communicating those values to different people in different business units within organizations. Quickly go back one slide and highlight at the bottom of the slide, there's two logos, 50001 Ready and Superior Energy Performance. These are the two voluntary recognition programs that the Department of Energy offers. I'm going to focus on 50001 Ready because its development really came out of those lessons learned of the challenges of implementing ISO 50001 for smaller organizations and those that are resource constrained. 50001 is a step-by-step framework that breaks down ISO 50001 into 25 approachable tasks. We try to put a little more of the English language into what is an ISO standardese written document. We try to provide more detailed and tangible guidance. ISO 50000 tells you what to do, but not how to do it. We try to provide a little bit more of the how. There is a DOE recognition program associated with 50001 Ready that does not require third-party verification auditing of your energy management system. We provide a certificate of recognition, but it is at your own organization's attestation that you are practicing the components of an energy management system as guided by 50001 Ready. More than any one recognition program or one piece of software, in this case highlighting the 50001 Ready Navigator, is that 50001 Ready is a suite of software in human resources. There are energy accounting softwares, energy performance improvement calculators, the energy footprint light tool, energy performance ENPI light software, as well as many training materials that are free for download and use, other educational materials, as well as technical assistance through a help desk function that we serve at the Berkeley Lab. 50001 also supports the enterprise or multi-facility support engagement of energy management. While the rubber hits the road in terms of energy use and consumption at the site, we know that corporations have a very sometimes detailed or hands-off approach to managing energy across multiple sites under their control. And we want to create tools that are adaptive to those different environments. As I said, 50001 is an adaptable set of resources, not just a recognition program. And we have a engagement that is open to any US-based organization to be a 50001 Ready partner. I put the logos of our current partners up on the screen. What being a partner means, it means that you get the rights to kind of co-brand the 50001 Ready Navigator. If you so enable it, your logo will appear on any recognition certificates provided to end users that are associated with your partner platform. It allows you to have insights into your customers or participants or people you're supporting with 50001 Ready, and allows you to co-brand other materials such as websites and flyers as well with the 50001 Ready logo and branding. If you're interested in being a partner, you can contact Ethan Rogers or myself. Ethan's email is on the last slide. With 3 different objectives, we're currently offering virtual training cohorts for manufacturers, and which is still open for enrollment, and we have had open enrollment and are closed now for in the commercial sector. There will be an upcoming effort around wastewater facilities and an upcoming effort around correctional facilities as well. There's also always an ongoing open enrollment for federal facilities to have a dedicated 50001 trainer coach engage with you and others in a similar environment on a virtual 9 to 12 month program with monthly webinars. Between monthly webinars, we offer one-on-one coaching and interaction with other cohort members through an online forum. One of our main objectives of this, in addition to having our primary objective of these training cohorts, is to have sites and companies be successful and find value in developing and utilizing a 50001 Ready based energy management system. Secondarily, we'd like to see the DOE's knowledge of the value and how to communicate that value of 50001 more broadly applied. So this is both a technical assistance offering as well as an enormous research project for us at Berkeley Lab and DOE. Again, if you're interested in joining a virtual training cohort, please contact Ethan Rogers or myself. And while we've done a lot of work to quantify the energy performance improvement resulting from those that practice 50001 based energy management systems, it really comes home in the quotes and the anecdotal evidence provided by those that are doing this. This is a quote from General Motors, who currently has all of their US-based sites 50001 Ready recognized for a little more than 2 years now. 50001 Ready is proven critical in managing operations at GM and is positioned well to meet net zero 2050 goals. So we see 50001 Ready supporting operations, decarbonization, its increased efficiency and optimized production, and supporting GM's responsiveness to the operational variabilities, resiliency piece, mostly induced by COVID-19 pandemic. These are the types of feedback, we appreciate the negative feedback as well because it helps us continually improve ourselves. But these feedback are the type that give us the confidence that ISO 50001 and 50001 ready can also be used to manage your energy-related decarbonization objectives. So where are we moving forward right now? How are we taking an energy management system platform and trying to adapt it to also include a prioritization for decarbonization? And what we're doing right now is that we are in an internal process of developing task-by-task considerations and strategies for decarbonization that go hand in hand with the current energy management guidance of the 50001 Ready Navigator. This is kind of open field territory for us, and we've kind of anchored now on three major points. First is from WRI and WBCSD is the greenhouse gas protocol, that kind of internationally accepted way of accounting, analyzing, and reporting carbon emissions and decarbonization success. Secondarily is from the US EPA, who has a fantastic set of resources at their Center for Corporate Climate Leadership. Specifically, I'd point anyone to their inventory guide, leveraging their resources as they are such a dominant leader of the climate change efforts in the United States. And lastly, ISO 14064, who has a whole suite of other ISO documents that really focus around the quantification and reporting of GHG emissions and removals. Well, we know that we at LBNL and DOE are not the end all when it comes to making our guidance around management activities a reality. Those on the ground and in companies and at supporting utilities and their coaching contractors are the ones that really do this day in, day out. And we are going to be looking to build up a stakeholder network to provide input on the draft materials we're developing, and to identify additional materials that would be supportive and adaptable by both private sector and public sector users alike. Again, we'll also be looking to develop programs that help pilot out these decarbonization objectives within an energy management system. So where we're at right now, again, is we're at that point where we're starting to want to build up that stakeholder network. We're starting to want to hear, we will want to have facilitated conversations and hear from you to make sure that anything we're developing is useful and not going to rot on some server somewhere in the back of a DOE website. We want to understand how you set carbon targets, how you consider determining reduction, how you determine and manage sources, how you quantify and report, and how you prioritize actions. Lastly, I'll make a quick plug for, at this critical juncture, considering engaging in the ISO standards development process, which is a scary, eye-rolly thing when you first think about it. But then when you step back and look globally, and look at the type of language that's coming out of different economic regions of the world around considering taxation or creating market entry requirements around carbon, the ISO standards will be probably the basis for those types of regulations and rules around the world. And this is the time at which the International Standard Organization is considering what types of standards around carbon measurement and management should be developed. The United States is a leader, both in the chair and secretary of ISO TC 301, which is responsible for ISO 50001. And we would welcome any and all to join the US Technical Advisory Group to help the United States put forward a strong voice in what these types of standards, on which many international and regional rules and regulations will be developed, should look like. And with that, I'd say thank you for your time, and excited to engage with you over the next year and more to make sure that we collectively are able to have the pathways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions so that we rise to the moment in this critical time of need. I've listed our Advanced Manufacturing Office Program Manager, Ethan Rogers' email here to contact. You can contact myself as well. And please do sign up for any email updates if you're interested in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks again to all of our panelists. And I'd like to go ahead and bring everybody back up on stage here for a time of question and answers. And we have a bunch to start with. So again, thanks all the participants for the questions that you've advanced here today. So you can continue to ask along the way as other questions pop into your head. But I'd like to start with the end. And Peter, there are a number of kind of steps around the decarbonization of industrial sectors. You've talked about strategic energy management. Ali spoke about electrification. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how we need to prioritize this work and the relative roles that different strategies might play in the overall decarbonization of industry, and maybe what about at the end when we've accomplished what we can with those strategies? Where do we go?
Sure. And it's a fantastic question, and one we get a lot in terms of, should I do energy management or X? And the answer is, think of energy management, 50001 based or other, as an enabling mechanism that helps your organization understand what it should actually do, how to prioritize it, how to resource it, and stay on track to make sure your objectives are met. So it's not energy management versus electrification, but it's energy management to bring your team together, to bring your organization together, to understand, does electrification make sense for us? Is it what we should pursue? Do we have enough capacity coming to our facility from the local provider? Should we be working with them to increase that? Or should we be looking for on-site solar generation to enable our decarbonization objectives? Should we be looking at alternatives to electricity instead to decrease our carbon objectives? So they're complementary. 50001 and energy management at large are a framing. It's a framework to have those conversations, and then a process by which to ensure that those decision points are enabled and resourced and successful.
Ali, similar question, kind of the order or the role of various strategies. And then we know that there are technology challenges around maximizing energy efficiency through energy management systems, through electrification. There are some process heating applications and other end uses that may be challenging to electrify. What do we do in those cases?
Well, my answer would be, there is no silver bullet, honestly. We need all of the above, and electrification is like one of the bullets. Where it's suitable, where the technology is available and mature, where it makes sense. For example, we have clean grid and hopefully cheaper electricity, then yes, why not? And honestly, I think the more I work on this, for many sectors and application, electrification, once cheaper renewable electricity will be available, I would say will become a low-hanging fruit for many sectors, compared to some other solutions that are important but more challenging, like hydrogen or CCS, requiring infrastructure, and in some cases not even applicable to smaller industries. So, but electrification is just one of the options. So we have to keep an open mind. As Peter said, having the system in place, ISO 50001 is a great kind of framework. And then once people sit around the table, see for their plan, for their company, what makes sense. And I think energy efficiency is a must, and still, despite people moving to more emerging options, we do need energy efficiency, as this conference is also organized by American Council for Energy Efficient Economy. But the emerging options like electrification, they will be important, and one of the key options we will have for decarbonization. That was my answer.
Okay, thanks. Liz, I'm interested in your perspective with this challenge that we see of trying to, with limited time, as Peter mentioned, limited resources, financial and human resources to make these things happen. How do you see your work helping to guide that? Tell us a little bit about how your analysis and how our viewers might be able to think about your analysis in terms of helping to guide these difficult decisions.
Well, thanks, Ferry. Yes, I think that what we're doing is a little bit maybe less applied, and so it's a little bit harder to see, but it mostly has to do with the fact that for all of these models, when we're trying to look into the future and say, what kind of savings are we achieving? there's a lot of assumptions that are baked in. And the assumptions are baked in by someone that's trying to say, well, how much energy is going to be used by industry or by whatever this sector is, and how much of it is going to happen in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. But when the more assumptions that we have, and the less that it's based on something that we can really narrow down and understand, the harder it is to know that that's true, the more uncertainty there is. So really what we're trying to do is diminish the uncertainty and try to get a little more resolution, so that instead of having modeling tools that are just putting all industry together or putting every kind of steel together in one, that we have a better way of trying to come up with the projections and say, well, actually, we know that all of those are getting retired, and now a plant that is based here and that is using this kind of technology is only going to be using electricity, or it's only going to still be using fuel. So that's the area that we need to concentrate on. It's just trying to improve resolution of models that everyone's using when they try to say how much GHG emissions or how much energy is being used.
Okay, great, thanks. And we had a couple of questions about the specific modeling tools that you're using. Can you just give us a quick description of what you're applying and the methodology you're using?
Sure. So we, like I mentioned, we use IAC data, and that's publicly available. And I guess, do you mean like the technical specifications? I use Python, and it will be on GitHub as I think right now it's on our internal GitHub, but we will release it so that other people will be able to use these tools to perform a similar analysis if they're interested.
Great, I think that answers the question. Ali, you mentioned the importance of temperature regimes, I think, in your presentation, and that high temperature process heat a little more difficult to electrify than moderate to lower temperatures. Although 2/3 of that may fall in that easier to electrify. What is it about higher temperature regimes that make it difficult to electrify, or conversely, why are lower to moderate temperature regimes more amenable to electrification?
Good question. I'm not sure if it has something to do with temperature or just the nature of process itself. As I mentioned, we have a steel industry which is high temperature, and we do have electric arc furnace which provide that high temperature. But then other high temperatures, for example, cement industry is another high temperature process, but because of the nature of that process, it's harder to electrify. Although there are some emerging solutions now, for example, the electrification for the pre-calciner, where 60% of the energy is used through indirect kind of heating by resistant heaters. So I'm providing high temperature itself is challenging. For example, a lot of electrifications, whether you talk about resistant heating or heat pumps, currently the commercial technology is providing lower temperatures. But when it comes to high, then both because of the high temperature needs, but also the nature of the process that we have, for example, for cement, for the chemical reaction, etc. I think that makes it more challenging. So the combination of having the high temperature, but also the nature of the process itself. Again, another example, we have electrified high temperature for the container glass production. As I showed you, we have an electrified melter. Commercial, there's a UK company, Electroglass, actually providing that technology. So it's, I don't know if I answered the question properly, but it's a combination of having the high temperature, but also the nature of the process itself. It's not just the high temperature for the sake of, being high temperature, so you can't electrify.
So strategies then to electrify higher temperature processes, is that a research area of interest, a gap that we need to fill, would you say, in the future?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, for all decarbonization, especially the emerging one, when we talk about electrification, whether hydrogen or CCS, but especially on electrification front, while we do have good range of commercial technologies that are not being properly or adequately deployed, we do need a significant R&D technology, or at least demonstrate them. And in a recent work that I worked on with a few of the national labs for AMO, we wrote this report on deep decarbonization of the US industrial sector. We had a huge focus on R&D, and a good amount of it was on electrification technologies for different manufacturing sector. Hopefully that report will be released soon and people can see some of the work we have done and suggestions we have given for the R&D in that front.
Okay, great. Thanks. Look forward to seeing that. Peter, we had a question that came in about sort of a standardized best practices approach for looking at ISO 50001, obtaining registration for that standard. And then shortly after, I think you spoke about 50001 Ready. Is that kind of the tool, the pathway that you are recommending going forward? And what can folks expect with that?
Yeah, it's one of the scary things about when you talk about an ISO standard, and specifically 50001, it is written in committee talk and ISO-E, so there is a translation to, so what do I actually do? And that's the first thing that 50001 Ready tries to do, is break down the standard into actionable parts. And one of the key resources there are what we call the playbooks, which if you recall back to college or high school and you had the big fat textbook, the playbooks are the thin, taller ones that are not hardback that you write in and scribble in. Those are the actual workbooks that go along with it. Makes it a bit more actionable. The other thing that people really worry about is the idea of an auditor coming in and a very binary result of yes or no, you're certified or you're not. And 50001 takes that away by having no auditor. You yourself as the site or the company are supposed to kind of look yourself in the mirror and saying, are we working on all of these? Are we doing things that are in the spirit of this guidance? Yes or no? And that is both intended to reduce a barrier of that certification. It does, cause us to get a lot of questions that we're happy to field and work with individuals on, of like, when is good enough for me to say I'm 50001 ready? Which leads to one of the activities that recently the ISO Standards Committee, with a lot of in particular Canadian involvement, was the development of a new standard that's soon to be published called ISO 50005, which is a phased approach to ISO 50001. And it's meant to take even those 25 tasks of the navigator, not the standard, this new standard is based on the navigator, but the concept of saying, I don't have to do everything today. I can start with a subset that's very meaningful to me and build out from there. And I think that's the area, one of the areas that we're going to be more and more pursuing in terms of guidance, resources, and trainings on, is we want to make sure people have a strong energy management system that can stand up to personnel changes, that is driving results and is meaningful to an organization. But we don't want the totality of a energy management system to be a barrier to getting going. We want to engage people and have them build up to a robust energy management practice versus having them walk away saying, there's no way I can get that done in a meaningful time frame where I'm going to look okay in my performance review.
Okay, great. I had a question, and I'm going to kind of ask this to the whole panel, about cost. And specifically when we're trying to perform the analysis to begin to think in terms of going that next step beyond technical feasibility to more realistic adoption potential of these technologies. And so I guess the first question is, some of the costs, Dr. Hassan Begi, that you mentioned, are they primarily theoretical, or a lot of the cost work that you've done, has it been actual sort of data available on the various electric technologies that you've analyzed, and do we feel pretty good about the capital and operating costs with respect to those for electrification technologies? And similar, Peter, do we really have a good understanding of the cost to execute a strategy of energy efficiency, regardless of the primary energy source or final energy source. So, Ali, I'll start with you first. So, talk a little bit about your source for cost data.
Sure. Just one thing to clarify. Our cost analysis, as I mentioned, was just the energy cost comparison. So we only looked at the energy cost based on, how much energy each of the processes, conventional versus electrified, using. And we made assumptions on electricity and natural gas costs. And that was our cost analysis. We did not do the cost analysis with regards to capital costs or other costs. So that was not it. But in terms of the energy part of our work, all the data, if you look at the report, everything is cited, referenced. So all the data came from both for the conventional electrified processes from literature where, these technologies exist, either, working fully commercially or at least at some pilots. So if you look at the report, the sources are provided. But one thing I want to, given the short time, very quickly mention, when you look at the cost for electrification and also other technology, especially emerging areas, you should definitely go beyond the just energy benefits that it gives. Even energy efficiency measures and technologies often are implemented not because of the energy benefit or energy cost saving. There are many other reasons the industry they go implement. Just give you an example on electrification. For example, if you electrify a cement plant, or that's an extreme, but even a steel plant or any other plant that where you are using actual fuel, and as you know, there is the cost associated with environmental compliance, whether you have end of pipe technology, scrubbers, things like that. So if you electrify, a lot of that will go away. So somebody needs to quantify those, like those cost benefit, in addition to improvement in maybe productions and other things. So my comment on cost would be definitely need to go beyond just the energy benefit cost and have a more holistic view. Then these emerging technologies, especially electrification, will become pretty attractive.
Peter, anything to add there?
I kind of amplify that point that Ali was making, that I kind of have a line of, a year or two ago, we saw most people approaching, looking for assistance with 50,001 ready, certification, SEP, whatever it was, or just information. Really focused, that made the decision to do this was around operational improvements, benefits, something larger than, we just want to save money. We do see the most mentioned benefit of 50,001 being cost savings. The second, very closely though, is production improvements, then system optimization. Then we used to see sustainability and cultural improvements. Those were from analysis of right around 100 case studies on 50,001 implementation. My guess is, and from what we've been seeing and hearing people come to us with, is that's changing by and large to being, I have a greenhouse gas emissions target I have to meet. Why do you have to meet it? Oh, I'm going to get fired if I don't. Or, we can't, the OEM we sell up to said, if I don't meet this, we're not going to do business with you. So the justification for this type of management practice has changed from being one of really around productivity and competitiveness to being around carbon. They're both still there. And when you frame it that way, the costs of implementing a business practice, whether it was around safety, security, whatever, in this case, energy or decarbonization, really become a cost of business and not a cost that is assessed against something other priority. From our research, we look at, standing up an energy management system, just like standing up any other business practice, has a cost. It takes a little more than a year to do it super well, and can cost you kind of a collective effort of an FTE. And then that dramatically reduces once the system's up and running. And there are lots of programs that will help you with that stand-up activation energy and cost, because it is real. It does take a little bit of blood, sweat, and tears to get that practice in place, but that's when you reap the benefits, is once it's up and running and maintained. So it much in line with what Ali's saying is, look at what are the operational, what are the productivity benefits of this practice, is don't approach energy management even from the narrowness of, I'm going to save because I don't pay as much money per kilo. My total energy bill is lower. That's a tiny fraction of why people are engaging in these practices.
Great. So what I hear is that the justification, the drivers toward energy efficiency, electrification, decarbonization are changing, and people are feeling more pressure. Liz, that means that we need a lot of data to help pull together what those numbers mean, both financially and to the performance of an industrial system. As an example, we've got a few questions on what kind of data would be helpful to you and how people might be able to share and participate in your work. What would be helpful to you? What sorts of data would be helpful in supporting our viewers in the kind of analysis they're going to need to justify the adoption of new technologies, for example?
Well, I have to break it down, I think, maybe the question, because in terms of the adoption of new technologies, I'm not sure, how much, like for an individual industry, or an individual firm, I'm not sure how much we could shed light through adopting our clustering approach. But basically, the problem with the work that we've been doing is that we're operating a little bit in a data desert. There's not that much data. So what there is that's available on a plant level, we will use. And if you have any that you're willing to share with us, or if you'd like to work with us, please reach out to me. And I would really love to talk to people that are interested in doing that. One thing I would mention with the IAC data, for example, there were some issues. For example, we couldn't use the production data in physical units. We could only use sales because the physical units were very inconsistent. And having better data in physical units is really helpful, especially when you have to span time periods. And it can get a little complicated trying to understand what the sales prices mean between different kinds of production processes. But also having higher resolution data, understanding a little more than just one number for something like electricity use or electricity demand, but having, better data that reflects the seasonality, having more representative data that deals with a larger number of industries would be really helpful. Even if it was a single region, but a lot of data, it would be helpful. So yes, please. We need a lot, and there's not that much out there that we've been able to find.
You mentioned clusters a few times, and can you describe just a little bit in terms of what are the descriptors that go along with a cluster? Can you kind of tell us what that is in terms of the data? Is it a group of NAICS codes that have similar attributes? So can you describe that for us? Maybe that'll help us to figure out what data you need to support your analysis.
Sure. So really, that's what makes it also kind of a difficult task. That's the task that we have right now, is that we're not trying to do it by NAICS code. What these are is they're just observations, and each observation represents one plant for which we have annual data. So we're putting them together and seeing that somehow they seem to form a group that's close in distance based on the observations that we have. But now we need to go in and try to understand what those clusters mean and if it's something that we can use in a meaningful way or not. And that's the part that we don't know yet, and we want to know. So we're going to have to go in. Luckily, the IAC data does give a pretty detailed description, like of products, but even so, we may find that this doesn't turn out to be that useful if we can't understand more about the cluster and how we could place a new plant into one of the clusters we found. That's kind of what we're working on now.
Okay, thanks. One last question for the group. Anybody wants to jump in? What do you see right now as the most significant barrier to electrification, decarbonization going forward in the next few years and attaining the goals that we're going to have to attain? Anybody have a final thought on the most significant barriers?
I mean, it's hard to point to one, but for electrification, at least, the topic that I spoke about, the cheap natural gas is not helping. And also, we need more renewable energy generation for sure, as I showed in my CO2 graphs, if you just electrify now. And that was for US. Like, I mean, in China, we started talking about it, but if you electrify using, the grid, very bad idea. And many countries are like that. So we need to decarbonize grid faster, and also the cheap fossil fuel is not helping. So those are the barriers for now, in addition to some other, but I would point to those two for electrification.
Peter, Liz, anything to add?
I guess I'd say, when you read any of the collective macro analysis on how do we hit our global, national, industrial, large decarbonization objectives, Ali, you've been a part of a number of these. There's always this enormous wedge that's like things we already have, and then there's a wedge of things we need in the future. Personally, it just comes down, we got to be more committed and serious about doing what we can already do today. You start with the efficiency, of course. There was a great slide yesterday around, start with the operation and maintenance stuff, start with the management practices, do the efficiency stuff that's already on the shelves, build up from there. The less you need to replace with grid electrification, the better. So do every little bit of efficiency you can today. And it's not, I think it's a personal statement of this. If truly the world's on fire, and where I live, the world is on fire in Southern Oregon, we got to do this. We got to collectively do this. And so it's less a question of what is the one little barrier technologically or one little policy here, there, but more, no, are we serious or not?
Okay, thanks. And I guess that's going to have to wrap us up. Thanks again, Peter, Ali, and Liz, for your contributions today. And just a reminder that this material will be available for participants afterward on the website. So thanks, everyone. And please look forward to you joining the remaining sessions in the conference. And that's all we have for today. Thanks now. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.